This video is over costume design. So what are costumes? Well, they are clothes that actors wear in a play. Duh. But did you know they're also jewelry, hats, shoes, undergarments, headpieces, wigs, and anything else that goes on the actor's body? The costumes help portray the character, meaning that they tell us information about the character visually. You should be able to look at an actor on stage and understand basic information about them based on their clothing. How old they are, what the weather is like, whose side they are on. Costumes also help the audience understand the place and time of the story, like the scenery and props. Ideally, they all go together to create a seamless world. The costume designer is the person that chooses the costumes. They are trying to help tell the story using the character's clothing choices. So what makes a costume special, and how does it differ from street clothes? Think about what you wore for Halloween in years past. Did it use materials that were like your everyday street clothes, or were the fabrics different and more suitable to the task? In some cases, they are made of cheaper material that won't withstand washing or hard wear because they are only for one day, Halloween. However, costumes for the stage actually have to be made of sturdier fabrics so they can withstand the actor's sweat, multiple washings, and a lot of use. Usually a costume is something you wouldn't wear every day because it isn't for you, it's for your character. What we choose to wear each morning helps define who we are to the people around us. Wake up feeling blah? Maybe you grab a gray hoodie. Excited about a new album dropping? Maybe you put on a t-shirt for that band, which communicates to others that you are a fan. Costumes help communicate information in similar ways, just about the character and not about the actor themselves. So to recap, how do costumes differ from everyday street clothes? Different materials, usually sturdier and suitable for the work they will be doing. Costumes are not usually garments you would wear every day because they don't relate to who you are as a person. They relate to broadcast information about the character the actor is portraying. They must be very durable. If you've ever worn a stage costume, if you look on the inside, you will notice meticulous stitching reinforcing places like underarms and pant seats so that they can withstand all the use and abuse that they get. So now we know what a costume is and how it is different than our street clothes. Let's move on to the 3 requirements a good costume design must meet. Number 1, the costume must reveal information about the character, such as age, occupation, wealth, and social position. These are the basics. If you see a character walking on stage in a short skirt and fishnet stockings, you're going to assume she is younger because an elderly lady doesn't usually wear these garments. If a character has on scrubs, you'll assume they work in the medical profession. If a character is wearing dirty clothing with holes, you might think they are broke. Whereas, put the same character in designer clothes and luxurious fabrics, and then you know they have come into some money. For social position, this is especially important in historical plays that are set in times when clothing was closely regulated. In Europe, sumptuary laws were used to denote who was noble and who was merely a rich merchant. Nobility could wear certain fabrics or even colors, whereas anyone else would be punished. But these are certainly not all. What else can you tell about a person based on their clothing? Think about your clothing and what it says about you. The second requirement a costume design must meet to be successful is that the costumes must reflect the setting of the play, meaning the time and place. We can see here 3 costumes that immediately tell us a lot of information about the character wearing them. On the left, we have a late 18th century men's costume, so we know the play is probably from that period. In the center, we can see a bathing suit and other pool or beach appropriate wear. We can deduce it probably isn't winter in this play. Finally, a man in pajamas. Well, we are probably in an intimate setting, like a home, because how often do you see grown men walking around in public in footy pajamas? It also might be nighttime or early morning. Finally, the third requirement of a good costume design is that it must work. The actor has to be able to perform in the costume, so it can't be too restrictive. It must breathe and allow for any physical activity that the actor has to perform. So to meet all these criteria, a lot of planning goes into the costumes ahead of time. The costume designer must study the setting, including the period, and who these characters are. Where do you think you could find information about these subjects? If you're old, like me, you might go to the library and find books on the period. Or you might search out periodicals, which are newspapers and magazines. This can be especially useful for research into styles over the last 100 years. Museums are a wonderful place to interact with art and actual garments from the time period. The Victoria and Albert Museum of Art and Design in London has entire collections dedicated to fashion throughout the ages, and even local museums will house paintings and statues from the period that show what people wore. Photographs are a great resource to see what people actually wore, not just when they dressed up to get their portrait painted. Of course, photography is limited to the last 150 years or so you won't likely find a photograph of anyone prior to the late 1800s, and will have to rely on artist depictions. Finally, and honestly, where you will probably find most of your research, online reputable resources. This does not mean run a Google search and pick the first image that pops up. You have to vet the websites carefully and make sure the images are of good quality, are truly from the period, and are accurate. Earlier I mentioned the Victoria and Albert Museum. They have fantastic online archives that can be very useful to a young or old costume designer. So, you've gathered research and you're ready to plan your costumes. There are 4 things you must consider as you choose what your characters are going to wear. First, you must consider the line or silhouette. This refers to the shape of the costume, which differs for every era. An example I like to use is the sack silhouette, popular in the late 1920s. Here we have the sack silhouette, or flapper look. Notice that all the dresses shown here are rather boxy, meaning they have very low dropped waists and hide the bust and curves of the female figure. It was considered desirable at this time to have a boyish figure, and women would even go so far as to use fabric to wrap around their busts and flatten their breasts. The second thing to consider when planning a costume is the choice of fabric. Fabric can communicate a lot of information about the character. For example, fabric can suggest social status. Luxurious textures like silk and velvet suggest a wealthy person, whereas rougher textures like cotton and loosely woven linens can appear less costly. Not only the texture of the fabric, but the weight is important as well. Regal robes require bulky materials like velvet and ermine. The white and black fur along the edge is the ermine. This denotes that the character, usually royalty, does not have to do physical work. They are so important they can stand around draped in 50 pounds of fabric. The opposite of that would be the fairies from Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. They are supposed to be otherworldly, and likely the actors need to move in a way that suggests that, so bulky material would not be appropriate. Rather, lightweight material like organza would better suit these characters. Finally, fabric can suggest the period we are in. Have you ever noticed that when a movie is set in the future, everyone wears leather and vinyl and shiny fabrics? These are considered exotic by today's standards, but we are to believe they become commonplace in the future. Third, when considering the design of the costume, you must think of the colors you are using. Color communicates a lot of information to an audience and can establish the play's mood and the personality of the character. For example, colors like blue and green are restful. They remind us of flowing water in nature, so they might be perfect for those fairies we discussed earlier. Red conveys danger or anger and is definitely a color that attracts the attention of the audience. You wouldn't want to put a background character in bright red unless you wanted the audience to watch them. Black denotes tragedy and is a somber, serious color. In Shakespeare's Hamlet, the title character is usually dressed in black because he is in mourning for his father. Purple suggests royalty. It is one of the colors that came under sumptuary laws in medieval Europe. The dye was so costly that only the richest and most noble people could afford it. White is often associated with purity and innocence, which is why brides are usually dressed in white. However, these color concepts are rooted in Western society. In other societies around the world, colors have very specific and sometimes different meanings. For example, in some Asian countries, white is the color of death, and so a bride would never wear white. Finally, the fourth thing you must consider when designing costumes is the decoration. This includes trim and accessories attached to the costume, such as buttons, laces, hats, shoes, fans, canes, and jewelry. Let's take a moment to return to the concept of silhouette, the shape of the costume. There are three basic types of silhouette. The draped line, like an Indian sari or an ancient Greek dress. These silhouettes are flowy and draped over the body, subtly revealing and obscuring the form at the same time. The second type of silhouette is the fitted line, which follows and reveals the shape of the body. For example, check out this guy's legs. He wants you to. It's the entire reason men in the Elizabethan period wore hose. The leg was considered a very manly and attractive feature, and so a fitted silhouette, rather than something looser like pants, revealed that shape. The third basic type of silhouette is the combination line, which combines the draped and fitted lines. The example on the right is an example of a summer dress from the 1800s. Is it draped, fitted, or a combo? It is largely draped with a flowing skirt that obscures the figure, but the bodice is fitted to show off the chest, so this is a combination line silhouette. Okay, as the costume designer, you are in charge of imagining and designing the costumes. You do this in league with the director, whose directorial concept will guide the entire show. As the costume designer, you must research the play, choose costumes that fit the period, mood, and style, as well as complement each other and the scenic design. The costume crew are the people in charge of making it all happen. These are the magic makers that work in the costume shop. There's a costume shop supervisor that oversees all the workings of the costume shop. Their assistant is called the first hand. The cutter draper is the person that creates the patterns for the costumes and cuts out each piece. These pieces then go to the stitcher, who sews them together and adds the embellishments. Once the costumes are made, it is the duty of the dressers and the wardrobe crew to maintain them. Laundry, ironing, helping actors into and out of costumes. Finally, the shopper is the person that buys everything needed to create the costumes. So if you like spending other people's money, this might be the job for you. It requires going to many, many stores to purchase fabric, clothing, and anything needed to create the costume. So once the costume designer has a costume in mind for a character, they will create rough sketches. These are a way to communicate ideas to the director. They're usually black and white and simple because you may have to make several versions before the final design is agreed upon. Once the costume designer knows what the final design is like, he or she will create renderings. These are in color, detailed images of the costumes. And here you can see several characters in one rendering. Attached to the bottom of the rendering are swatches, small pieces of fabric showing what the costumes will be made out of. So once the renderings are complete, how do we get costumes? The renderings go to the costume shop, where the costume crew either pull costumes that already exist in storage, buy costume pieces that can be found in retail stores, or make costumes from scratch. Making the costumes is called building the costume, or the build. You can also rent costume pieces from large costume warehouses. A piece of paperwork that comes in handy during this stage of the process is the costume plot. This is a chart that shows every character and what they are wearing throughout the play. This tells you what you need and at what point in the show it is needed, which shows you also where the quick changes are. These are times an actor has to change costume in under a minute, so the costume must be rigged to easily come off and on with the help of the dressers. Here's an example of a costume plot for Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. Notice across the top, the acts and scenes are labeled, and along the left side are each of the characters. The colored boxes show you what costume they are wearing at certain points during a play. So for example, we can tell that Beatrice has 3 costumes throughout the play, blue, purple, and cream, whereas Benedick has 2, brown and light blue. Finally, let's look at the steps of the entire costume design process. The primary step is to read the play. Everything you know about the character and setting should be rooted in the play. After reading the play, then you will meet with the director. This meeting is important because it is how you will discover what the director's concept for the show is. You should listen for key words about that concept or vision so that you are on the same page. Next, you will conduct research. This is largely visual research, images of people in the place and time period of the play and what they wore. You should also look for images from the character's place in society, what people of different socioeconomic backgrounds wore, and how different occupations were dressed. The example here is from The Great Gatsby. Set in the 1920s among people who are very wealthy, the research images a designer would look for should reflect those facts. Third, create the costume plot. As described before, the costume plot shows every character in every scene and what they are wearing. Now that you know what costume pieces are needed and you have a grounding in what the time and place looked like, you can begin to create rough sketches of what you think the costume should look like. These are usually black and white and simple, as you can see here. Once the director approves them, you go on to create renderings. Renderings are in color, detailed, and show what the costume will look like on stage. They may also include swatches or small samples of fabric. Once the final renderings are approved, it's time to build the costumes. The costume designer will work with the costume shop during this time to make sure their original designs are created. The costume shop manager oversees the work in the costume shop, creates the budget, assigns the work, and maintains the schedule. It is very important that the costumes are completed in a timely manner so they can be used during technical rehearsals. During this part of the process, the designer sees the costumes on stage and can make any final changes. Once the show opens, the designer's job is usually done, and it is up to the wardrobe crew and dressers to maintain the costumes until the show's closing. This has been Costume Designs. The end.